I've known Father Sirico for many years. As I said, I've been at Acton for 16 years, and I've had the opportunity to travel with him, to sit in countless meetings with him, to hear him speak to diverse audiences, and to read his many commentaries and newspaper columns over the years. And what strikes me time and again about Father Sirico is how quickly he's able to sort of penetrate to the root issue or to the core of an issue, and then bring out some new and interesting insight that at least I hadn't seen before, and I'm sure many of you will experience that as well. I've actually never really known a more insightful teacher and compelling religious thinker than Father Sirico. I would say he's the embodiment of a public intellectual par excellence, as you would know if you've even had a casual conversation with him. He's often called upon by members of the broadcast media for statements concerning economics, civil rights, and issues of general religious concern. And he's provided commentary for such news outlets as CNN, ABC, the BBC, NPR, and CBS's 60 Minutes, among others. So in addition to leading his leadership as president and co-founder of the Acton Institute, Father Sirico is actively involved in parish ministry, being on the staff of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish here in Grand Rapids. As president of the Acton Institute, he's lectured at countless colleges and universities and businesses throughout the U.S. and abroad, and his writings have been published in a number of different venues, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, London Financial Times, and the Detroit Free Press. In his book, his new book, which is available through the Acton bookstore, Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy, Father Sirico shows how a free economy is the best way to meet society's material needs. And it's only if we have economic rights and freedoms that we can protect ourselves from government encroachment into the most private and sacred areas of our lives, right down to our consciences. Please welcome Father Sirico.
Well, I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Welcome to Grand Rapids. Our friends from Slovenia tonight gave me a wonderful gift. It's my book in Slovenian. But I need to talk to them because I noticed on page 249 there is some grammatical errors. So we'll have to talk about that later. But no, it's really good to see you, and I wish we could invite all of you to our new building, but you would overwhelm it as big as it is. But the future of our work has become so apparent to us, and we feel so gratified and humbled by the friends we have here in this room and the many friends we have all over the world, and some of you who have been our friends for a long time when we were unknown, to have invested in these ideas and established relations with us, and now you're just the newest generation of being with us. Now, there's a real challenge in presenting this opening lecture because my job description says that I have to set the ground rules, or the intellectual ground rules, the intellectual framework for the entirety of our discussion that will remain. Now, that's hard to do year in and year out, and to try and tell it in different ways. So from time to time I'm going to allude to things that some of you may have heard and may not have heard, or if you've read the book, maybe some of the stories in there that make points that I am just too fatigued to come up with a new way of saying. And so it is the case that one day I was in an airport and there was a delay of the flights due to the weather. And this is a common occurrence in the experience of those on our staff who travel a lot. You're gonna face delays in airports, so you better bring some good writing with you. That's reading with you, or as Sam Gregg does, reading and writing both at the same time. with him. And so I was sitting there in the waiting room listening for an announcement about how long the delay would be, when the storm would pass over, and all of that. And I noticed that a gentleman went up to the desk and said to the airline personnel that he needed to get out of there, and he wanted to know what she could do about that. She said, "I'm sorry, it's beyond our control." He said, No, you don't understand. I paid first class for this ticket, and I have to be in a meeting. And she said, "Yeah, I know, and there are other people in a similar situation, and I don't know what to tell you." He said, "No, do you know who I am? I'm your highest level on this airline. I'm an important businessman. You have to do this for me." And she said, "There's just nothing we can do." He said, "Do you know who I am? You can't just tell me no." And she really tried every psychological ploy in her toolkit of personnel management, customer relations and all of that. And he just kept saying, "Do you know who I am? Do you know who I am?" And she finally said, "Wait just one moment." He said, "Oh, okay." He stepped over to the side and she pressed the microphone and she leaned in and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen in the waiting area," and everybody perked up because we thought, now we're going to get out of here. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention for a moment? Does anyone know who this gentleman is? Because he keeps asking me who I am, who he is, and I don't know who he is." And of course, he sneaked over to the side very sheepishly. But in a funny way, that really brings us to what we're doing, not just tonight, although I'll kind of try and probe it with you tonight, but really in the whole of our time here. I think one of the unique things about the 100 and some courses that we're offering these few days, and the thing I think that attracts such an incredible diversity of people, because we didn't set out, there were no quotas for us to have X number of people from different ethnic groups or language groups or geographical locations. We don't do it that way. You seek us out and we assess your capacity to understand what we're doing and your value to getting this message out to other people. But what is it that has drawn us, and the unique kind of paradigm out of which we operate at the Acton Institute is simply a right understanding of who human beings are, so we can answer a guy like this. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do know who you are, sir. Let me tell you." And that's what I'm going to do now. If that lady had had my notes in front of her, she could have given him a good education on who are we. So the great burden of the opening lecture, as I've said, is the keen awareness that being on the verge of 2 decades old, or actually now going into we could say our 3rd decade, the Acton Institute has built up a certain amount of steam. We see that particularly in our new building that is such an encouragement to us, not because it's a building, but because it reminds us of the seriousness of the ideas and the permanency of these ideas that we are engaging. It was our intention when we began the Institute not merely to make the intellectual and theological case for the harmony between a free society and a virtuous one, but also to build a network of kindred spirits. It's not just teaching, but it's building this network that you are the latest addition to. We are spiritual and intellectual cousins, if you will, who share some basic ideas in common, but who do not necessarily all walk in lockstep and in unanimity in all matters. Here I'm reminded of that ancient maxim that's been attributed to many sources. In necessariis unitas, in dubiis libertas, et in omnibus caritas. In all things love. The last phrase, in all things love. But why love? What a manifestly confused word that has become. Despite the oceans of ink spilt in an attempt to define it, it is still a profoundly confused word, nowhere more so than I think in North America, at least in the United States. I'm always attentive to warn couples at weddings that were I love, I would sue for misrepresentation of character. Because those of us who speak American, in particular, fall into this confusion in our talk of our love for our automobiles, or our love for that meal, or that drink, or that building, or whatever it happens to be. Now, no Italian would ever say that he loves his car, even if it were a Lamborghini. He doesn't say he loves his car. No, he loves his wife. He loves his child. He loves his mother or his father or a good friend, but he doesn't love his car. In fact, the colloquial expression in Italian is very revealing. When one speaks to a beloved, one uses, even in the colloquial usage of Italian in a secular, growingly secular society, uses a theologically rich idiomatic phrase. Ti voglio bene. What does that mean? It means I will your good. Imagine that. Little baby, I will your good. You beautiful woman, I will your good. Now, I'm not saying that every Italian understands the full theological import of what he's saying, but the language retains the insight of the tradition, the theological insight of what love really is. This definition of love indicates that it's more than a sentiment. It is a discipline, a choice, an act of our will. Ti voglio, to you I will the good. I raise this question of love at the outset of what undoubtedly will be an energetic and intellectual encounter over the next few days, because I think that by understanding what we mean by human love, we gain a window into the mystery of the human person. That phrase, the mystery of the human person, may seem odd, I would imagine, to the strict materialist who sees man as essentially defined by his physiological material atomistic parts. Shakespeare's Hamlet, having lost all joy at his father's death, and what he sees as his mother's infidelity, grapples with this mystery in his depression. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me to be a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air. Look you, this brave or hanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with golden fire. Why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a nice piece of work is man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? This contemplation of our nature, alternating at times between man's transcendence and baseness, is nonetheless a necessary first step to an ordered liberty suited to man's dignity. It was a frigid December day in 1974 when the Nobel Peace Prize for Economics was presented in Stockholm. The presentation of the Nobel Prize is always a kind of intellectual coronation, as it were, where the intellectuals are looked to in order to provide their plans for society. The recipient that year was Friedrich von Hayek, and it is fair to say that he shocked this entire glittering audience by saying the exact opposite of what one might have expected from a newly minted Nobel laureate. Instead of putting on display his knowledge, Hayek chose the occasion to draw attention to the utter incapacity of intellectuals to assemble enough information to reorder society according to their own designs. This constituted a rebuke to those who would presume the knowledge and intelligence not merely to override the rights of the human person, but to transform them into their conception of what a social being ought to look and act like. So here's what Hayek said. If man is not to do more harm than good in his efforts to improve the social order, he will have to learn that in this, as in all other fields where essential complexity of an organized kind prevails, he cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of the events possible. He will therefore have to use what knowledge he can achieve, not to shape the results as the craftsman shapes the handiwork, but rather to cultivate a growth by providing the appropriate environment in the manner in which the gardener does this for his plants. There is danger in the exuberant feeling of ever-growing power which the advance of the physical sciences has engendered and which tempts man to try, dizzy with success, to use a characteristic phrase of early communism, to subject not only our natural but also our human environment to the control of the human will. The recognition of the insuperable limits to his knowledge ought indeed to teach the student of society a lesson in humility, which should guard him against becoming an accomplice in men's fatal striving to control society by a striving which makes him not only a tyrant to his fellows, but which may well make him the destroyer of civilization, which no brain has designed, but which has grown from the free efforts of millions of individuals. Close quote. Knowing what we know and knowing what we do not know is an important thing. It is said that inscribed on the portal over the temple of Delphi were the words, "Know thyself." Thus it seems to me that that is a good beginning for any thinking about the construction of a society worthy of the human person. After all, how we conceive of ourselves, what we are made of and capable of, what rights, if any, we possess, all this and more will depend on the kind of society that you and I will construct. Like Shakespeare, we probe this question with a sense of wonder, sometimes with a sense of depression, and even at times with a sense of despair or disgust. The very fact that we can wonder or be revolted or lose hope at the tragedy of a possibility not attained are all themselves indications of our dignity. We have the ability to self-reflect, and we have the capacity not merely to know, but to know that we know and to know that there exist some things beyond our knowledge. This capacity for transcendence takes place from within the reality of our corporality, our physicality, which is the first and most obvious thing that we know about ourselves and that we know about others. We see ourselves in the mirror. We see one another as we look about. We are located in time and space, but somehow we know that there is something more to us than that. We're made up of a biological component with all of its proclivities, but we're not defined by that. We relate to the material world and we depend upon it, yet we do not ultimately discover our meaning in it. We transcend it. And here is something that is subtle yet critical because of its subtleties. And it's often confused by sincere people. The relationship between our transcendence and the body is not that of inhabiting a physical form. We are not spirits inside of flesh. According to Christianity, that's a heresy. Princeton University professor Robbie George, a good friend of ours, when speaking in another context, put it this way, and I think this is dense, but it's worth meditating on. He said, quote, "What each of us refers to as I is identically the physical organism that is the subject both of bodily actions such as perceiving and walking, and of mental activities such as understanding and choosing. Therefore, you and I are physical organisms rather than consciousnesses that merely inhabit or are associated with physical organisms," close quote. Or to put it more simply, because I'm not a Princeton University professor, so I don't have all of that training beyond my intelligence, one may say that we are not spirits inside of flesh, but that we are spirits and flesh. And flesh. What proceeds from this anthropology in terms of human dignity and the construction of the free and virtuous society is vastly different from its alternatives. By holding these twin poles in tension, we have in place a corrective to any radical thugs to the opposite or exaggerated extremes, where truth may go mad, as Chesterton tells us. We avoid the reductionist trajectory that says that all things are relative. There is no truth, because if you simply deconstruct man to his essence, all you have is physical reality, no sublime or transcendent core to him. But we also avoid a kind of heavenly mindedness that is no earthly good, to quote the Baptist preacher. Other than a useful homiletical device, this is critical to avoid, because any ethics predicated on such a notion, that we are so heavenly minded we are no earthly good, implies some kind of exogenous set of rules imposed upon mankind, yet intrinsically unrelated to human flourishing. Here on two fronts we find the seeds of moral relativism that rejects the idea of morality and ethics as a set of objective obligations that emerge from the truth, the full truth of who human beings are and their origin, in their purpose, and in their destiny. Moreover, it is this anthropological, indeed cosmological approach that enables us to argue that the is implies the ought, lest we find ourselves under the sharp blade of Hume's guillotine or in the murky swamp of moral skepticism, unable to distinguish good from evil, indeed even to say whether there be good or evil. We see a version of this dualistic error in another set of twin heresies within socialism itself, or whatever they're calling collectivism on the campus these days. In confronting the existential fact of original sin, collectivists at once both deny and radically embrace human sinfulness in the following way. Sin is denied when the attempt is made to establish elaborate and all-encompassing systems of control, security, intervention, of course, always for the common good, that fail to take into account that whoever you can find to run such systems are not themselves immaculately conceived, right? So the sin affects the whole thing. Yet sin can also be seen to be radically pervasive to the extent that one believes human beings can never be trusted to conduct his or her own economic affairs. Now, while this is true that human nature contains the distinction between our corporeal and transcendental aspects of our reality, this does not imply that human beings are some kind of metaphysically schizophrenic entities. These two aspects of the human character are what make up the human reality. This existential condition, undeniable to reasoning people, means that there is an interplay and an overlap, even while there is a distinction between the material and the spiritual aspects of our existence. I think that marriage clearly demonstrates in a beautiful way the interplay of physicality and spirituality, most especially when procreation is the result. The child emerges from the parent's love, and offspring. What a poetic way to put it, isn't it? Have you thought of that, the word offspring? Offspring, to describe it. Who is both physical and spiritual himself or herself. The same kind of overlap, or what Jacques Maritain might have said was the effort to distinguish in order to unite, can also be seen in the social realm. Here we shall see personal liberty dovetails with economic liberty, and religious freedom dovetails with the right to property. Now let us look at this another way. The physical body is what places the human person in relationship to the material order, right? And yet the human relation to the natural world is uniquely different from the relationship of animals to the material world. Animals are bound to things by instinct. Human beings are bound to things by our reason, by our minds, by our will. As self-reflecting, thinking beings who survive by the use of our reason, the human mind becomes the predominant element that makes humans distinctly human. Thus, people are both generically and essentially distinct from the animal, who cannot reason. Now, here is where property and humanity come together, something very important to understand. It is this rational relationship between human beings and nature that gives rise to property, because property, correctly understood, emerges from the interplay between man's physicality and spirituality. Our capacity to reason enables us to relate to the material order in a way that is more than immediate and temporary. Our relationship to the material order is rather general and permanent. Stability and permanency are the expression in time of the universality of the nature of human beings to things. Neither is our relationship merely one of consumption, but it is also one of possession and of creation or production. Property is the foundation and the context of this relationship, because without possession, we ultimately cannot create. By the relationship of the human person to nature, we leave the imprint of our individuality upon nature by means of the time, effort, labor, ability, knowledge, history, whatever genetic traits we bring to the thing, the whole package that produces wealth and property. Wealth and property do not exist in a state of nature. Hobbes put that in a memorable line: the state of nature is brutish, mean, nasty, short, red in claw and tooth. No, they come into existence only when people place value on things and begin to define the manner by which they are used in service to other people. The Mississippi River is an example. It was merely something to observe, something to fish in for centuries, largely unnoted until the discovery for the purposes of navigation and trade and transportation. Then it becomes a vital lifeline. Then its value changed, and its purpose as a wealth producer became evident when the same resource came to serve the whole of society and improve well-being overall. In the state of nature, it is a body of water. When we add the element of human reason, it becomes an asset that serves others. One thinks of the refinement of petroleum, likewise, into energy or sand, silicone, into the means of information transfer, which we know as cell phones and the rest. When seen in this light, property rights are an expression and a safeguard to human rights, so that the defense of the right to property ought not to be seen as the defense of the right to a detached material object in itself, but a defense actually of the dignity, liberty, the very nature of the human person who has this capacity. This is so important for us to understand when we are confronted with curtailments on religious liberty. It's not just the claim to being free religiously that is key. What will ground that concretely is the claim to the right to have our own property so that no government may violate it or confiscate it or redistribute it. I think the great flaw of the 19th century liberalism, which, by the way, has a great deal to commend itself, was nonetheless its utilitarian foundation, which would eventually become mesmerized with the notion of getting things to function well, rather than with the nature of things in themselves and the moral imperative implied by such a nature. Its boundless optimism in 19th century liberalism was predicated on a flawed view of the human person, one that underestimated the capacity of evil to emerge from human nature, in which that mechanistic social and economic functioning cannot control. The danger of a false notion of liberty or of the human person should then be clear to anyone who thinks about it for a moment. We speak here not so much of the individual as much as the person, because the concept of the person carries so much more meaning and so much more depth than an individual. It enables us to understand the necessity of human beings' relationship to one another, the interplay between their autonomy and their need for community, and the imperative to balance these dimensions so as to avoid doing violence to either truth. The kind of society that emerges when the human person is seen as essentially the sum total of his material parts, and the kind of protections and freedom he will accord under such a society is radically different from the one that would evolve, that did evolve, whose guiding anthropology was that of an immortal being, unique, unrepeatable, eternal. Similarity, a culture that defines liberty as license and as having nothing in necessary connection to the truth of human flourishing, will be decadent, will be oppressive, will be and has been deadening, as we have seen throughout history, and truth be told, are observing in our modern societies as well. So I just suggest that we pause at this juncture to note a primary fact with regard to the free economy, which has provided such an unprecedented prosperity wherever it has really been permitted to function. The important issue here is not the laudatory fact of material progress, which is true, which is real, but something more. It is human flourishing itself. I think it's the opening of the argument for freedom that I attempted to write in this book that opens with the image of the Korean Peninsula by night. It's interesting to look and see that North Korea is dark. Other than the communist capital where there are few lights, all the rest is dark. You can't see it from space at night. South Korea, on the other hand, is ablaze with lights. Just reflect on that image, or the newsreels that we may have all seen, the long lines of people, hapless people who had the great misfortune to live under communist regimes. It is the restriction and the marginalization of the state, and thus the enhancement of personal initiative, creativity, voluntary communal bonds, that is the great achievement of the free economy. Not just its economic and material success. I suggest to you that that is the threat that is aimed at us today by those who are bent on their quest for political and bureaucratic power. That is what we are about today, building a network of freedom over our different languages, over our different cultures, even over some of our different theological traditions, where we can work together and, in the words of the late, great Chuck Colson, be co-belligerents in the battle for the dignity of human life and the culture of freedom. In conclusion, I would just like to note something that has become so manifestly apparent that to state it is almost to be redundant. Just think back a few decades, which may be hard for some of you who are only a few decades old. But you have Google, and you have YouTube, and you can go back in time, as it were, and look at what it was like 3 or 4 decades ago. And think about this. The colossal wreck of collectivism in Central and Eastern Europe, and pray God that this will apply one day to the central planning in China and North Korea and in Venezuela, that this colossal wreck of collectivism has permanently and irrevocably indicated its practical uselessness. That it was and it remains, in Hayek's apt phrase, a fatal conceit. I began this evening's discussion by drawing attention to the two dimensions of the human person, to our experience of physicality and the spiritual. I do not believe that they can be separated intellectually, and I would urge you as you approach this week to keep this in mind. It is true that the spiritual dimension is not usually discussed in events focused on discussing topics like economics and politics. But I do believe it is unavoidable. And I think that we can all be enriched in our understanding by addressing it. Some might say that the spiritual dimension of man deserves no place in a setting that seeks to be scientific. I don't believe this either. I think people have made a mistake between the scientific and scientism. It seems to me that Newman refuted this nostrum over a century ago in his idea of the university. I seriously doubt that science can teach us so much as long as we seek, let me rephrase that. I seriously doubt that science can teach us much as long as it seeks to gain an understanding only from what we can see and touch and smell. This is naturalism, not science, to use the distinction that Alvin Plantinga has recently made in his recent book. The reason for this has to do with our tendency to assume that whatever we see and observe will be a fixed part of the universe, one that we inherited and that one that will always be present. This is a grave error in economics, in politics, and social theory generally. If we want to truly understand human freedom and its place in the world, we must gain the capacity to think abstractly about what the world would be like without it. We need to imagine a past, for example, before the development of modern capital structures to gain a full appreciation of what modern economic methods have in fact accomplished. We need to reflect on what we cannot see. We need to develop the capacity of imagining how the human condition would be very different and indeed frighteningly diminished in the absence of human liberty. Similarly, we need to cultivate the ability to dream of the blessings of liberty that we are denied when we refuse to grant it. The work that remains to be done, indeed the task that we are about this week, is to clarify in our own minds and in our spheres of influence what the choice between freedom and servitude implies for us and our societies. And we need to clarify in our minds what the end of freedom truly is. Not merely having, not merely choosing, but living in a way that fulfills our moral and spiritual obligations in a manner compatible with human dignity and its nature. And choosing what is good for all, temporally and transcendently, rather than choosing what merely benefits us immediately. This is the intellectual project. We can discover how to build and sustain a society that is both free and virtuous. Thank you very much.